Have you ever found yourself in a remote, snow-laden forest, on the verge of giving up on everything, only to discover that one life-changing encounter could redefine the boundaries between humanity and the wild? Would you dare to feed a starving predator, one whose eyes flickered with both desperation and an uncanny sense of understanding? Could the fragile trust of a pregnant wolf, teetering on the brink of survival, spark a deep compassion in your heart and open your eyes to the raw, untamed beauty of nature? And when everything you hold dear, career obligations, life's demands, and looming uncertainties, collides with this fragile bond, how far would you go to safeguard a wild creature's future and perhaps find yourself forever changed in the process? Join us in reflecting on this true story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification for more daily stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you are watching, for we would love to hear from you. Keanu Reeves awoke in the pre-dawn hush, the cold mountain air clinging to the fabric of the tent he shared with Matthew and Stephen. The film crew had been hunkered down in this remote forest location for weeks, battling unpredictable weather in hopes of capturing a series of outdoor scenes for their latest project. As the world outside his sleeping bag came into focus, Keanu realized something felt off. A subtle tension rippled through the silence, as if the forest itself held its breath. Suddenly, Matthew's urgent whisper sliced through the stillness. "Keanu, don't move," he hissed. The quiver in his voice told Keanu all he needed to know. Something dangerous was nearby. Slowly, Keanu turned his head. Through the thin fabric of the tent, a large silhouette was visible. Its tapered ears and the outline of its muscular body were unmistakable. A wolf. It had slipped into their campsite and somehow found its way into the open tent flap they'd carelessly left unzipped. In any ordinary situation, the presence of a wolf would be alarming enough, but there was something else. Keanu's keen eyes caught a telltale swell around the animal's midsection. She was pregnant. Matthew and Stephen were practically fused to the far wall of the tent, their expressions locked in terror. The wolf's breath ghosted into the chilly air, and each exhalation reminded them just how close they were to a cornered, hungry predator. Yet, there was something in the wolf's posture that kept Keanu from outright panic. She appeared desperate. Yes, but not aggressive for the sake of it. Instead, every line of her body suggested a wild creature pushed beyond her limits. Acting on an instinct he couldn't fully explain, Keanu slowly reached for the leftovers from the previous night's dinner, a small piece of steak he had wrapped in foil. The wolf's ears flicked at the motion, her golden eyes fierce yet tinged with unmistakable need. Holding his breath, Keanu gently tossed the steak toward her. In an instant, the animal lunged, snapping up the meat. A wave of relief, mixed with awe, flooded him as the wolf devoured the scraps with a desperate urgency that told an entire story of hunger and survival. No one spoke. Matthew and Stephen stared in disbelief as, once the last morsel of meat was gone, the wolf took a single hesitant step closer to Keanu. Her nostrils flared, testing his scent. Ignoring the warnings from his friends, Keanu extended his hand. Heart pounding, he felt a surge of adrenaline as he prepared to withdraw at the slightest sign of aggression. Instead, the pregnant wolf lowered her muzzle, letting him gently rest his palm against her head. In that fleeting moment, the air seemed to hum with unspoken understanding. Then the wolf backed away, padding to the tent's entrance. She paused, glancing back as if to take in the three men once more. A few heartbeats later, she slipped into the pre-dawn darkness. It felt like the whole encounter had lasted an eternity, but the watch on Matthew's wrist later revealed it had been barely 15 minutes. After catching their breath, the three men crawled out of the tent and examined paw prints in the snow and dirt. Matthew trembled in lingering shock, while Stephen kept shaking his head. "That was insane," Stephen muttered. "Absolutely insane." Keanu, for his part, couldn't chase away the memory of the wolf's eyes, those glimmers of desperation and flickers of trust. Later that morning, As the crew tried to resume filming, the story spread among them. Some were amazed, others were frightened. Word reached the local wildlife officer, who explained just how dire the situation had become for the region's wolves. Changing climates and pressures from human developments had forced predators closer to populated areas. Most scrounged scraps or starved. The officer's dire accounts painted a grim picture. Many packs have been decimated by competition with bears over territory or by humans who viewed wolves as threats. Now, a lone pregnant wolf had braved a camp of people, likely as a last resort to feed herself and the unborn pups. That night, Keanu couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he thought of the wolf's cautious step forward, the faint brush of her fur against his hand, and the silent plea in her gaze. He'd always been attuned to animals, but this connection felt deeper, almost fated. Somehow, he knew that walking away from her would be impossible. As the freezing rain turned to relentless snow, the film's production schedule spiraled into chaos. What had begun as a manageable outdoor shoot now involved collapsing tents, malfunctioning generators, and a morale level that sank lower each day. Yet for Keanu, the only constant in this otherwise turbulent period was the wolf. She began to visit every morning, her approach announced by fresh paw prints in the snow or the faintest shuffle of movement near the campsite. At first, she would simply lurk at the perimeter, her golden eyes following him as he stepped out to leave a small portion of meat or other scraps. Without fail, she devoured every offering, the hunger in her eyes a stark reminder of how dire her situation truly was. Over time, caution gave way to a tentative routine. Keanu would place the food and step back a respectful distance. In return, the wolf gradually let him stand closer each day, as though acknowledging his willingness to care for her. Matthew and Stephen, initially gripped by fear, found themselves caught up in the wonder of it all. This was a wild animal, yet one that seemed to be forging a fragile friendship with their colleague. They stayed at the forest's edge, uncertain whether to intervene or simply watch. The rest of the crew, if not preoccupied by the daily grind of trying to keep the chute afloat, occasionally cast wary glances into the woods. Nobody wanted trouble with a potentially aggressive predator, but no one could ignore the transformation taking place before their eyes. In the 2 weeks since that first encounter, the wolf's belly had grown more pronounced. Keanu wondered daily if she would soon give birth and whether her uncertain diet would be enough to keep her pups healthy. A local veterinarian, whom they consulted through the small village at the foot of the mountains, estimated she had at least another couple of weeks to go. That timeline weighed heavily on Keanu's mind. He knew that if her living conditions didn't improve, or if the weather grew more brutal, the outlook could be grim for mother and babies alike. One particularly harsh day, the skies unleashed a sudden storm so intense that the film crew had to pack up vital equipment and seek sturdier shelter. Their flimsy tents were no match for the lashing winds and heavy snow. Exhausted and cold to the bone, they retreated to a local roadside lodge, only to find every room booked with travelers stranded by blocked roads. Word reached them of a larger cedar lodge deeper in the forest, one that was rarely used but could be rented for the right price. Desperate for stability, the producers immediately negotiated a deal. The next day, a convoy of trucks and vans wound through ice-laden roads until they arrived at the cedar lodge. It was a sprawling wooden structure, old but sturdy, with smoke curling from a massive stone chimney. The lodge stood at the edge of the very woods where Keanu's wolf friend roamed. To him, it felt like fate lending a hand. Within 48 hours, they had moved everything: props, filming gear, personal belongings, and those tattered tents. Grateful to be out of the biting cold, the crew settled into rooms warmed by crackling fireplaces. The lodge overlooked a wide clearing that ended where the thick pines began. To Keanu's relief, that clearing was near where he'd often spotted the wolf. At last, he could keep track of her without braving the nightly storms in a tent. A day later, as the sun set behind the mountain range, Keanu stood on the back deck of the lodge, peering into the encroaching darkness. He felt a tug of worry. Would the wolf follow them here? Or had they abandoned her territory, leaving her confused and alone? Just then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Emerging timidly from the tree line, the wolf appeared. Keanu's heart leapt. That first evening at the lodge, he placed fresh meat on a makeshift feeding station he'd cobbled together. A small platform under a tarp, not too close to the lodge, but sheltered from snow. From the deck, he watched her slink forward, step by cautious step. When she finally reached the meat, she cast a glance at him through the dusk. He nodded, as though reassuring her she was safe. Slowly, she tore into the food, swallowing it in needy gulps. In that fleeting moment, it felt as if an unspoken promise passed between them. He would keep her fed and safe for as long as he could. The next morning, as the crew busied themselves with filming around the lodge, Keanu consulted with the property's caretaker, Maria. She was a quiet woman who had lived in these parts for decades. If anyone understood the rhythms of the forest, it was Maria. When Keanu told her about the pregnant wolf, her solemn eyes softened with sympathy. "Be careful, Mr. Reeves," she said gently. "Wolves can be unpredictable, but if she trusts you, that means everything." Settling in a lodge life proved simpler than expected. The production team adjusted to the new surroundings, grateful for sturdy walls and a reliable heat source. Filming resumed with renewed energy, and at night, the old wooden corridors filled with laughter, hushed conversations, and the crackling of fireplaces. Keanu, though always part of the camaraderie, never forgot the real reason he was here: the pregnant wolf whose survival now felt deeply personal. A few days after their arrival, Keanu decided to enhance the feeding station. The battered tarp was replaced with a solid awning, anchored firmly into the ground. He constructed it so the wolf could approach without feeling cornered, leaving space for a quick escape if she sensed any danger. Before, he might have worried about how this extra project would appear to his colleagues, but word had spread through the crew. They knew about the pregnant wolf, and many had started rooting for her in their own quiet ways. Stephen, initially the most apprehensive, became especially curious. Each morning, he rushed to check the motion-activated camera installed near the feeding station, eager to see if the wolf had visited overnight. Matthew, too, found himself drawn to the deck at dawn, a mug of coffee in hand, eyes scanning the tree line. Day by day, the wolf's presence seemed less like a threat and more like a symbol of resilience amid nature's hardships. As autumn yielded to the first real blasts of winter, the forest grew silent under layers of fresh snow. Now, when Keanu ventured outside to leave food, his boots crunched through icy drifts. The wolf would materialize from the trees, her belly unmistakably larger, looking expectantly toward him. Sometimes she ate quickly and vanished into the pines. Other times she lingered, golden eyes locking with Keanu's in a stare that felt almost human in its intensity. He wondered if she recognized him as the same man who had once dared to reach out and touch her head under a flimsy tent roof. One evening, while the sky glowed with the last embers of sunset, Keanu, Matthew, and Stephen stood on the back deck, quietly observing. The wolf arrived right on time, but something else stirred among the trees. 2 or 3 sets of eyes gleaming in the half-light. "Are those other wolves?" Matthew whispered. For a moment, fear gripped them. If a larger pack was nearby, the risks could escalate. But the silhouettes fled as soon as the pregnant wolf moved closer to the feeding station. Whoever they were, they seemed content to keep their distance. Maria, the lodge caretaker, offered insights gleaned from decades of living near these woods. "She may be alone now," Maria told Keanu, "or she might have been separated from her pack because of her condition. Sometimes pregnant wolves wander to find quiet dens away from the main group. She'll do what's best for her pups, no matter what it takes." It was a harsh truth. The wild was both beautiful and brutal. Keanu had glimpsed only a small fraction of its challenges. Even so, his resolve to help the wolf stayed steadfast. In a way, caring for her also renewed his own sense of purpose. The daily tasks of filming, Memorizing lines and dealing with Hollywood deadlines could be draining. This connection to a wild, pregnant creature put everything else into perspective. The hush of the forest, the crunch of the snow underfoot, and the wolf's trusting gaze were reminders of life beyond the scripted roles and studio lights. Yet reality insisted on intruding. One frigid morning, Keanu's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, a call from his agent in Los Angeles. A film project he'd committed to months prior had been abruptly fast-tracked. Production was set to begin in New Zealand, and they needed Keanu on-site in mere days. He tried to negotiate for more time, but the schedule was unyielding. "I'm sorry," his agent said. "We can't push it back any further. You need to be on a plane within 3 days." That night, as the crew sat around the massive wooden table in the lodge's main hall, Keanu voiced his dilemma. Matthew and Stephen understood his frustration. They knew how badly he wanted to stay until the wolf had given birth. Stephen suggested reaching out to a wildlife rescue group, but that carried its own risks. Interference from an organization might chase the wolf away or lead to her capture if authorities deemed her a threat. Keanu wanted her to remain free, yet supported. In the end, Maria calmly placed her hand over Keanu's. "Don't worry, Mr. Reeves. We'll look after her in your absence. She trusts you, but she also trusts this place now. I'll make sure she's fed and safe, and I'll call if there's an emergency." Maria's firm tone and kind eyes made it clear she was serious. Keanu felt a measure of relief, but a gnawing guilt remained. Would the wolf understand why he suddenly disappeared? Would she be okay without his familiar presence? Over the next 2 days, Keanu prepared meticulously. He left enough funds to cover the wolf's food and any medical emergencies. He wrote up a schedule for Maria and the few crew members who were staying on at the lodge for post-production tasks. The local vet was on speed dial, ready to help if the wolf gave birth under dire conditions. All the while, Keanu's heart ached with worry each time he looked at the clearing, knowing he had so little time left. On his last morning, the wolf showed up just before sunrise. Snow draped the pines in a surreal hush. She ate her usual meal, then lifted her gaze to find Keanu standing with a travel bag slung over his shoulder. He barely breathed as he waited for some sign from her. In that moment, the wolf paused, head tilted as though sensing his sadness. She took a few slow steps forward, her breath steaming the cold air between them. Then, just as gently, she retreated back into the forest, leaving him with the crushing knowledge that their time together, for now, was over. A swirl of obligations swept Keanu thousands of miles away from the secluded cedar lodge. Once in New Zealand, he found himself immersed in a very different world. Bustling sets, costume fittings, script readings, and the continuous churn of studio demands. When cameras rolled, he slipped into character with professional focus. But whenever filming stopped, his thoughts drifted to the forest he'd left behind. He couldn't help but picture the pregnant wolf wandering through snowy pines, waiting for the sound of his footsteps on the deck. Weeks stretched into months. The production in New Zealand was grueling, with long days and constant schedule changes. Yet in every rare moment of calm, Keanu checked his phone for updates from Maria. She emailed or messaged sporadically whenever she had news. "She's looking healthy," read one note, accompanied by a blurry photo from the lodge's deck camera. In another, Maria described how the wolf chose a den near the clearing, hidden under dense brush and a fallen pine trunk. Then came the news he'd been anticipating most. The wolf had given birth to a litter of 6 pups. Maria's message was jubilant, tinged with awe. "All 6 are alive," she wrote. "I've only caught glimpses, but they're definitely in the den. She seems to be taking great care of them, coming to the feeding station as often as she can. The weather is still tough, but I'm doing my best to leave extra food." Keanu read that email in the middle of a production meeting. Tears welled in his eyes before he could hide them, surprising the director and his co-stars. He apologized, blaming exhaustion. But privately, he was overjoyed. The pups were safe. The mother wolf he'd helped was thriving, at least as far as Maria could tell. Time passed in a haze of call times and press obligations. Christmas came and went, then the new year. Word spread that the pups were growing quickly. They had started to appear outside the den, their unsteady steps echoing the curiosity of youth. Maria reported that some days, the mother wolf would lead them toward the feeding station, although she remained cautious about letting them wander too close to human structures. The mother's golden eyes, now sharper and less haunted by hunger, seemed to keep a constant lookout for dangers. Occasionally, Maria would mention other wolves near the perimeter, howls echoing through the night. Perhaps the mother wolf was connecting with a local pack, or perhaps they were simply curious passers-by. In either case, the mother wolf showed no sign of aggression or desperation anymore. She had gained strength and confidence. Keanu longed to return. The necessity of his film contract, however, kept him bound to an ongoing shoot. Each time he asked for a break, studio executives reminded him of deadlines, budgets, and marketing plans. Still, the thought of that clearing bathed in dawn light, with a mother wolf trotting up to greet him, lingered in his dreams. When he woke, he could almost feel the crisp forest air filling his lungs. Finally, 14 months to the day since he had last been at the lodge, Keanu stepped off a plane at a small regional airport near the forest. He drove a rented SUV up the old, winding roads that he knew so well, heart pounding with a mix of hope and anxiety. Snow still dusted the treetops, though it was not as deep as before. Early spring had begun to melt the drifts, revealing patches of earth beneath. By late afternoon, the Cedar Lodge rose into view, a comforting sight. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Maria stood on the porch with a welcoming smile. He parked and climbed out, immediately breathing in the sharp, pine-infused air that he had missed for so long. Maria wasted no time. "She's still around, she said, ushering him inside to warm up. And her pups, well, they're not really pups anymore. They're quite big, come by most evenings. You'll see for yourself." Keanu's excitement warred with trepidation. Would she even recognize him? Had she integrated into a larger pack and become wary of humans again? He gazed at the clearing through the back window. The sun was dipping, the sky streaked with oranges and pinks. "Come on," Maria said softly, handing him a pair of binoculars. "If she appears, it'll be soon." Stepping onto the deck felt surreal. The memory of that final morning, when he'd stood here with a travel bag over his shoulder, clashed with the hope he felt now. His breath caught when movement flickered at the edge of the tree line. He lifted the binoculars, scanning the forest. There she was. Her golden fur had lost some of its scraggly desperation, replaced by a lean, strong coat that gleamed in the waning sunlight. She looked every bit the wild wolf, confident and proud. Around her were 6 other wolves, nearly her size. They moved with fluid grace, a cohesive group. The flick of an ear, a subtle shift in posture. These were animals that understood both their environment and each other. Heart thumping, Keanu lowered the binoculars. The mother wolf abruptly raised her head, as if catching a scent on the breeze. In one smooth motion, she let out a powerful howl. The sound reverberated across the clearing, filling Keanu's chest with an aching nostalgia. Maria gave his shoulder a gentle push. "Go," she urged. "There's no need to wait." Keanu bounded down the lodge's back steps 2 at a time, the final rays of sunlight stretching his shadow across the clearing. His breath felt caught somewhere between exhilaration and fear. Fear that the mother wolf, upon seeing him, might turn away or even vanish into the trees. But the urgency in her howl left no room for hesitation. As he crossed the open ground, the other wolves fanned out in a loose semicircle behind her. They were nearly her size, sleek and strong, each one a testament to her successful motherhood. Their eyes glowed with curiosity. Would they accept him as she once had, or view him as an intruder? He slowed as he approached, palms open, body language as unthreatening as possible. The mother wolf remained still, her gaze locked onto him. She sniffed the air, testing his scent. It felt as if the entire forest paused to watch this reunion. Slowly, she advanced until only a few steps separated them. Keanu saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the same golden intensity that had captured him so many months ago. A low, soft whine escaped her muzzle. It was neither a threat nor a greeting that lesser creatures would understand. But Keanu felt its meaning in his bones. She remembered him. In that moment, the distance between them collapsed. He reached out his hand, mindful of her wild nature, but also trusting the fragile bond they'd formed. She pressed her head gently into his palm, the same way she had done in that fateful tent encounter. Tears blurred his vision as he knelt, letting her muzzle come close to his shoulder. Her fur was thick and smelled of pine needles, wind, and freedom. Behind her, the 6 younger wolves stepped forward cautiously. Their mother's acceptance of this human emboldened them, and one by one, they moved in to sniff at Keanu's sleeves and boots. They were no longer tiny, stumbling pups. They were live, confident creatures, the wilderness running strong in their veins. And yet, just for an instant, curiosity overcame caution. From the ridge above, an echoing howl drifted through the chilly air. The mother wolf's ears twitched. She stood straighter, eyes fixed on the horizon. The younger wolves tensed, glancing at one another as though receiving wordless instructions. A pack was waiting, others who roamed these woods, strong and unbound by human dwellings. Keanu's heart tightened. He sensed that this homecoming was bittersweet. She had found a place in a pack, and she would not remain at the lodge forever. She took a few steps away from him, then paused, looking back over her shoulder. The silent question in her eyes was impossible to ignore. Would he be okay letting her go, now that she was free and thriving? Keanu rose, swallowing against the lump in his throat, and nodded once. "Go on," he whispered, voice unsteady. "Be with them." As if she understood, the mother wolf tilted her head back and let out a final, resonant howl. Her grown pups followed suit, their voices rising into a choir of raw, natural power. With that, they broke into a purposeful trot, heading toward the ridge where silhouettes of the waiting pack stood against the fading sky. Keanu watched until they disappeared, his chest heavy with awe and a quiet, aching sadness. The clearing, once the site of their daily feedings and fragile trust, was again empty. But now it felt triumphant rather than forlorn. She had survived the hardship of pregnancy, delivered her pups, raised them to strength, and discovered her rightful place in the wild. Eventually, he turned to see Maria standing on the deck. She raised a hand in a gentle wave, her expression solemn yet understanding. He trudged back up the gentle slope. Without speaking, they both knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. A new chapter had concluded, but the essence of it, compassion, understanding, and the inexplicable bond between human and wild, remained. Inside the lodge, warmth enveloped him like a hug. The crew who had stayed on for post-production had caught glimpses of the reunion from the windows. Matthew and Stephen, who had arrived earlier that day to coordinate with the local film office, approached with hesitant excitement. "Did she remember you?" Matthew asked quietly, though the answer was written all over Keanu's face. "She did," Keanu whispered, sinking into a chair by the roaring fireplace. His heart was full, and yet he felt the hollow realization that, in many ways, this was the final goodbye. He closed his eyes and recalled that first terrifying morning in the tent, the pregnant wolf stepping inside, her ribs showing beneath her coarse coat, and the moment she trusted him enough to accept a scrap of food. They had both traveled a winding path to arrive here, forging a bond that neither had sought, yet both had needed. Outside, twilight deepened, and the forest awakened with nocturnal calls. Somewhere in the distance, he imagined he could still hear her howl, echoing across the mountains. She had found her pack, fulfilled her instincts, and ensured her offspring would thrive in the wild. For Keanu, the memory of her trusting eyes and the brush of her fur against his hand would remain a reminder of what it means to step outside one's own world and offer help, not knowing if it would be accepted or repaid. Stephen brought a mug of hot tea, and Matthew clapped Keanu gently on the shoulder. They didn't need to say much. The warmth in their eyes told him they, too, felt changed by what had unfolded here, in this quiet stretch of pines and snow. Humans and wolves were not meant to exist in perfect harmony, but sometimes, for a moment, they touched each other's lives in a way that transcended fear and instinct. In the end, what happened between Keanu Reeves and the pregnant wolf was more than just a chance encounter. It was a profound lesson in compassion and respect for the natural world. From that first moment of fearful surprise to their final meeting in the clearing, they bridged the gap between human and wild in ways neither could have anticipated. Keanu's willingness to feed and care for her during the harshest days of winter allowed her to bring 6 new lives safely into the world. In turn, the wolf gave Keanu a new perspective on resilience, survival, and the delicate balance of nature. Although they parted with howls fading into the distant hills, their bond remained a testament to the power of empathy. For a brief time, the barriers of species and circumstance dissolved. The wolf's trust had been hard-won, but freely given, showing that even in a dangerous and uncertain environment, understanding and kindness can spark hope. For Keanu, it was a humbling reminder that sometimes the truest connections arise in the most unexpected places. Their story raises important questions for everyone. How should we respond when confronted with a wild creature in need? Should we let fear and caution dictate our actions? Or do we dare to extend a hand? Ultimately, the wolf's survival and the healthy growth of her pups stand as living proof that caring for those in need, human or animal, can create ripples of change far beyond a single moment in time. The mother wolf returned to her pack strong and free, and Keanu was left with an unbreakable memory. Both in their own way found what they were searching for: